Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today, everyone. So I'd like to start by thanking the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse for inviting me to present this webinar. Yeah, I'm really excited to be talking to you all. So today's presentation is looking at sexual assault against older women and how we might work towards achieving a sense of justice in response to these experiences. So I think this is a topic that is becoming increasingly important for a range of reasons. So firstly, we know that there's rapidly aging populations across most Western countries, certainly including Canada and Australia, where I'm from. We've also seen increasing focus and acknowledgement of the extent of gender-based violence and particularly sexual violence over the past few decades. Although, as we'll see, most of the research to date has really been focused on younger women and middle-aged women. So it's really much more recently that we've started to see recognition that sexual violence actually does impact upon older individuals and particularly older women. So I think it's quite timely that we start to think about what justice might mean in response to the sexual assault of older women. And certainly there are some questions that we'll address about how we ensure that justice can be achieved in response to older women's experiences. So today I'm going to start by just giving a pretty general overview around, well, what do we actually know about sexual violence against older women? How often does it occur? What sort of contexts are women experiencing sexual violence in? How does it impact on older women? And what are some of the issues around disclosure or non-disclosure and how we're responding to older women? And as we'll see, some of these general issues have follow-on implications for how we think about justice. So I'm then going to move on to look more specifically at what we know about criminal justice responses to the sexual assault of older women and some of the key barriers to achieving justice in this setting. And I'd like to finish by considering some different avenues for how we might think about achieving justice in response to the sexual assault of older women. So I'll look at that within the context of the criminal justice system, but I'm also going to look at some broader concepts of justice. So how we might think about developing what we call victim-centered justice responses, and also the importance of a social justice response. Okay, so before we move on to look at issues around sexual assault or sexual violence, I think it's important to ask, what do we actually mean by older age? Who counts as being an older person? Who's included in this category? So I certainly come from the perspective that old age is a social and cultural construct. So there's no stable, underlying, essential experience of older age. It's something that has shifted over time and place and across different social and cultural contexts. So of course, there are definitely material and physiological realities of aging. We do see changes to our body, how it functions, the rates of different disease or illnesses and so forth. And of course, these material or physiological changes also inform how we think about and experience old age. But who counts as being old and how we think of an older person definitely shifts over time. So as one example, the baby boomer cohort are renowned for doing aging differently to their parents. So for example, they're sort of not willing to settle down in the same way that perhaps their parents' generation were. So old age and definitions of old age also vary quite significantly across the literature on aging, and particularly around sexual violence and aging. So this is very important. As we'll see in a moment, it creates some substantial methodological challenges. So generally speaking, in the academic literature, older age refers to people who are in their 60s and beyond. But this does vary. So I've seen studies that have used 50 as the starting age. Sometimes we see physiological markers or something like entering menopause for women as the defining point of when someone becomes old. We sometimes also see these distinctions between early, mid, and deep old age. So early old age typically means people in their sort of 50s, 60s. Mid old age is 70s and 80s, and deeper old age is usually 80s and beyond. So this is quite important to acknowledge, firstly because we have quite different experiences of old age and also understandings of who or what an older person is, depending on that stage of aging that you're in. I think this is also really important just to acknowledge that when we're talking about older people, we're actually talking about quite a diverse cohort. So within this early, mid, and deep old age, we have people from across, 3 or 4 different generational cohorts, and their lived experiences are going to be quite different from one another. So even though I'm talking about older people as a kind of collective whole today, I think it's really important to keep some of these complexities and excuse me, differences or distinctions within this group of older people in mind. So the second thing we need to define here is sexual violence. So what do I mean by sexual violence, and what counts as sexual violence? So again, for the purposes of the talk, I'm going to be drawing on the following definitions. So this is drawing on the World Health Organization definition, and also Liz Kelly's work on the continuum of sexual violence. And these definitions are quite broad and inclusive. So as you can see, they really include any sexual, physical, visual, verbal act that's experienced by the woman or the girl as constituting assault. So it's a very victim-centered definition. It's really focused on the subjective experience of the individual. So these definitions are much broader than legal definitions, and because I'm drawing on research from across a whole range of different jurisdictions, I think it's appropriate to use a more general definition. But it's also important because sexual violence will still have, or has the potential to have, a negative impact on victims, regardless of whether or not that experience meets any legal threshold of perpetrator accountability. I'm going to use the terms sexual violence and sexual assault interchangeably today. Okay, so what do we actually know so far about sexual violence against older women? So certainly most of the research that's been done to date has been mostly concerned with looking at how common or how prevalent this type of experience is for older women. So current estimates actually suggest that sexual violence against older women isn't that common, particularly in comparison to younger age groups. So these are some statistics from the UK, from Hannah Bowes and Nicole Westmoreland's work. And they found that of recorded rapes and sexual assaults, so these are incidents that have been reported to police or to the criminal justice system, that women in their 60s and over were only 0.6% of recorded rapes and 1.4% of sexual assaults by penetration. So a very small minority of the total number of reported incidents of sexual violence. So we also see, if we look across the research that's been conducted on sexual violence in older women, in the past 12 months, estimates of sexual violence have ranged in these studies from about 0.8% to 8%. So there is quite a bit of variation there, but again, these statistics tend to suggest that sexual violence is not a very common experience for older women. We certainly know that sexual violence against older people is very gendered, as it is across the life course. So women are most commonly the victims, although I do think it's important to acknowledge that older men do also become increasingly vulnerable to sexual violence as they age. So even though these data sources tend to suggest that sexual violence against older women is quite rare, there are some really significant limitations with these data sources. So I'm going to go through some of these limitations in a second, but I think what this suggests is that we need to be treating these prevalence rates as baseline figures, as the bare minimum. So what are some of the challenges that we've seen with these studies? So firstly, older women are often excluded from larger scale data collection on sexual violence. So in Australia, for example, we have the Personal Safety Survey that's conducted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So that's one of our major data sources on prevalence rates of sexual violence. And people who are living with cognitive impairments and people who are living in institutional settings, so settings like an aged care residential facility, are routinely excluded from these types of surveys. So this means that some of the older people or older women who are perhaps most vulnerable to experiencing sexual violence are being excluded from our sources of data on sexual violence and what gets counted. We also see different definitions of older women used across these different studies. So as I touched on earlier, talking about definitions of older age, different studies have operationalized different definitions of who counts as being old. And of course, that's going to have follow-on implications for how much violence we're counting in these studies. We also see different definitions of sexual violence being used across these studies. So some studies will draw on definitions similar to the ones that I went through at the start of this talk, so quite broad and inclusive definitions, whereas others will look more specifically at forms of sexual violence that come under the remit of the criminal justice system and that would be covered under criminal law. So again, that's going to have a substantial influence on how much sexual violence we're counting and what's getting picked up on. There's also some questions about the extent to which older women themselves actually understand and define sexual violence. I'm going to look at this in a bit more detail later on, so I won't say any more now. Of course, we see different sources of data and different research methodologies. So some studies will talk to older women themselves, whereas others are really relying on things that have been observed by aged care staff, for example. So again, that will have substantial influences on what's actually detected. And we also see amongst the research that's been done an over-reliance on studies that have actually been reported generally to the police or the criminal justice system, or older women who've presented to a crisis service or a counselling service, and incidents that have actually been observed by aged care service providers. And we know that most victims of sexual assault don't report their experiences, particularly to the police. And likewise, a lot of incidents are not going to be observed by service care providers. So again, very limited range of experiences that are going to be counted in those types of studies. So the second issue is around how we actually understand the conceptual, I guess, and theoretical frameworks for sexual violence against older women. So how we define sexual violence and understand its causes has implications for what actually counts and what's getting picked up on in these studies. So we tend to see two main models being used. So the first are gender-based models. So these are frameworks that define sexual violence as being a form of gender-based harm. So sexual violence is seen here as a gendered phenomenon. So it's gendered in the sense that we know it's something that is overwhelmingly experienced by women and something that's overwhelmingly perpetrated by men. It's also gendered in the sense that sexual violence is seen as something that men do to women as a way of perpetuating and maintaining gender-based inequalities and power-based differentials. So even though this type of understanding is quite powerful and has a lot of explanatory value, it's much less able to account for, or it might ignore, the ways in which older women specifically experience sexual violence and the role that older age might play here. So, for example, it's perhaps less able to account for sexual violence that's happening in the course of providing care to an older person, or older women being targeted because they're seen as being vulnerable because of their age as opposed to their gender, or perhaps because of both their gender and age. The second dominant conceptual and theoretical understanding that we see is sexual violence being conceptualized as a form of elder abuse where older people are targeted because of their age. So, of course, this type of model then fails to take into account the ways in which sexual violence against older women is gendered. It also has the effect of potentially decontextualizing the occurrence of violence across the life course. So an elder abuse model might not recognize that violence in later life is occurring as part of longer term patterns of abuse. So long-term family violence might be reframed as elder abuse as the woman enters older age. And as I said, this decontextualizes the abuse and fails to perhaps recognize the ways in which these experiences across the life course are interconnected. So I think under both of these frameworks, it's quite likely that the full scope of sexual violence perpetrated against older women is being excluded or certainly downplayed. So I think this also highlights the need for theoretical frameworks that are actually accounting for the intersections of gender and age, and of course, likely other factors like race, class, and so forth. So we are increasingly seeing some scholars arguing that women become increasingly vulnerable to sexual violence as they age because they're disadvantaged as women and as older people. So we need to take that intersectional interplay of factors into account. So another point that's really important to acknowledge here is the prevalence of sexual violence across the life course. So even though we're looking more specifically at sexual violence that occurs in later life today, it is really important to acknowledge that this happens right across women's lives. So we know from the World Health Organization that around 1 in 3 women will experience some form of sexual or physical violence in their lifetimes. And it's also important to acknowledge that a large minority of men will experience sexual abuse in childhood. Within Australia, we know that around 1 in 5 women experience sexual violence as adults. And that figure, again, is likely an underestimate. It's a baseline figure. So I think what's really important to acknowledge here is that sexual violence is a common experience, and a significant minority of older women and men are going to have experienced sexual violence at some point in their lives. And this has implications for how we think about sexual violence against older people. So, for example, if a woman has experienced sexual violence before or at multiple points throughout her life, this can have implications for the impact and harm or distress caused by any subsequent experiences in later life. And we do also know that some older people might disclose early in life experiences for the first time as they become older. Okay, so what do we know about the contexts in which sexual violence against older women occurs? So we know, firstly, that older women are experiencing sexual violence across a range of different contexts, and some of these are more unique to their status as older women, while others are quite similar to sexual violence against younger women. So certainly we know that older women are experiencing violence within the context of intimate partner and family violence, whether that's violence that's been ongoing throughout the woman's life course or violence that begins in later life. So we know that, excuse me, this violence takes place at home in private spaces. We also know that women are experiencing this type of violence in healthcare and aged care settings. There's some evidence to suggest that older women experience sexual violence in public spaces, although this is perhaps the least likely of all these scenarios. We also know that perpetrators are predominantly men, and again, that's the case across the life course. So research to date has identified current and ex-partners as being perpetrators, typically in that context of intimate partner and family violence. But we also see family members, friends, carers, and aged care and health professionals. And this is particularly or more unique to older women as they're coming into settings where they're more likely to require support and care from professionals. We also see co-residence for women who have entered aged care facilities, and much less commonly we see stranger sexual assaults as well. So it's really difficult to know which of these is the most common or typical experience for older women. Again, this varies a lot across studies depending on their methodologies. So some research tends to suggest that sexual violence that's perpetrated by other residents in care facilities is the most common, but it's also the case that these incidents are probably much more highly visible than sexual violence that's perpetrated by, say, a carer or a health professional. And of course, as with all sexual violence, the perpetrator is most commonly someone who is known to the woman. So how does sexual violence actually impact upon older women? What are the consequences of this violence? So again, some types of harms or impacts are more specific to older women or are more likely to occur in older victim survivors, whereas others are impacts and harms that really just occur they're common to all victim survivors. So these impacts can occur both in the immediate aftermath of a sexual assault, but also in the short, medium, and longer term. And as we'll see in a moment, some of these impacts have specific follow-on implications for how we think about achieving justice. So we know that older women are more likely to receive genital injuries as a result of experiencing sexual violence. So this is thought to be due to changes that occur during menopause, where the vaginal tissues become thinner and more fragile and more prone to tearing. Although it is important to note that physical injuries in general are not common in sexual assault and sexual violence. So the fact that there's no additional physical injury doesn't mean that nothing's happened. For older survivors, we also see a more rapid decline in cognitive and physical health in the aftermath of a sexual assault. And I'll come back to this later because it's quite important when we're thinking about justice responses. Likewise, we also see increased mortality. So older women who have been sexually assaulted might experience quite rapid declines in their physical and cognitive health and maybe at increased risk of passing away post-assaults. We can also see signs of distress and changes in normal or usual patterns of behaviour, and this is particularly relevant for older women who might have a cognitive impairment or dementia. So this might be the only way that they can really communicate. So we might see things like distress around being dressed or being assisted with toileting and bathing activities. And some researchers have argued that the impacts might be more severe or more heightened for older women in comparison to their younger counterparts, but I think it's very difficult to establish whether this is actually the case or not. So some of the more general impacts that we see across all victim survivor groups include things like physical injuries, although as I've mentioned, that's not a common outcome, STIs, incontinence and pelvic pain or discomfort, so physical symptoms. We also see emotional and psychological symptoms, so increased rates of depression, anxiety, fear, and so forth. And there's also social impacts. So we might see older women withdrawing from their social and romantic relationships. They might lose interest in sex or no longer find sex pleasurable. And I think this is particularly important to acknowledge for older women because we have this myth or misperception that older people in general are asexual and they're not necessarily interested in sex. And we are seeing research increasingly show that that's really not the case. So it is important to acknowledge that sex is still important to many older people. So this loss of interest in sex or not finding sex pleasurable is really important to acknowledge and be aware of. And we can also see issues with intimacy and trust, and again, particularly within sexual contexts. So I think it's important to note here that firstly, there's no one normal or correct way for a victim to act post-assault. So they might experience some or all of these types of impacts, or other victim survivors won't experience any. These are just typical impacts that we know from across the research to date. We also know that the extent to which a victim might be impacted by a sexual assault and the specific impacts that they experience can vary quite greatly. So it can really depend on the individual, their life history, whether they've experienced sexual and physical violence before, and the specific circumstances of the assault. Nonetheless, I think these impacts really illustrate the extent to which sexual violence can impact on women, in addition to the violation of bodily autonomy and sexual rights that is caused by the assault in the first place. I think it also illustrates why we have to take sexual violence against older women seriously when it does occur. It has substantial impacts or implications for women's quality of life as they come into older age. So what do we know about disclosure and responses to sexual violence against older women? So most of the research to date, as I said before, is documenting the prevalence of sexual violence. So disclosure responses are considerably more under-researched. We do know more generally that victim survivors of sexual violence can face very significant barriers to disclosure. I'm going to look at some of these examples a bit more in a moment when I talk about criminal justice responses. So we know that most victim survivors delay disclosure, although most people do disclose eventually, and that's usually to an informal source like a family or a friend. But because of the lack of research on older women specifically, we don't actually know if these patterns of disclosure are actually the same for older women, but certainly we know that they are likely to face quite substantial barriers. So how someone responds when a disclosure is made is really vital to what happens next, particularly in terms of whether the victim survivor continues to disclose and whether they seek further support through counselling, for example, and whether they feel able to report to the criminal justice system. So how we're responding to disclosures has very direct implications for access to justice. So like I said, there's very limited research on disclosure responses to older women. So myself and a colleague, Dr. Catherine Barrett, conducted a study a couple of years ago now on aged care service provider responses to older women who disclose. And we also have Hannah Bowe's work on the views of sexual violence practitioners around sexual assault against older women. So these two studies suggest that responses are not ideal to older women when they disclose, and that service providers in particular face challenges in responding appropriately and in providing support to older women when they do disclose. And this is more specifically within the context of aged care facilities. So in our research, we found that there was often a lack of institutional policy and practice protocols. So if someone responded, a service provider didn't really know what to do, what was the protocol, who do you go and tell next, do you contact police, and so forth. So there was, I guess, an uncertainty around what should be done in the absence of these types of policy and practice protocols. We also found that service providers might have a limited understanding of what actually constitutes sexual assault. So typically people might assume that sexual assault has to be the most sort of serious, violent version of sexual violence, as opposed to adhering to that broad definition that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So this means that a lot of experiences might be discounted if they're observed or if they're disclosed. We also saw aged care service providers adhering to different rape myths and misconceptions. So that idea that sexual violence has to be very extremely violent would be one example here. And also ageist stereotypes. So for example, that idea that older people are asexual and not interested in sex anymore, therefore they're not at risk of sexual violence. Certainly there was a lack of training around how to respond appropriately to disclosures, and poor relationships with counselling and support services. So a lot of service providers didn't know where to go, for example, to put an older woman in contact with appropriate support services. A really substantial barrier, particularly in the context of aged care institutions, was the victim survivor being unable to communicate what had happened to her. So if she had cognitive impairments or was non-verbal, and also being in poor health. So this could have substantial implications for the survivor's ability to actually engage in processes following on from a disclosure. I do want to quickly acknowledge features of good responses as well, and things that helped women disclose and helped service providers enact an appropriate response. So establishing trust with the older woman could be vital. So in creating a safe relationship where the older woman felt able to come forward and say what had happened. Secondly, staff being really aware of older people's usual behaviour patterns, so they were able to notice those changes in their normal behaviour post-assault. The operational environment itself, so as I said before, the lack of clear policy made it difficult to respond appropriately. So conversely, environments that have a clear policy and procedure in place could really facilitate a good response. The nature of the incident played some role here. So things that were unambiguously sexual assault or sexual violence tended to be identified and responded to better, whereas incidents that were perhaps a little bit more ambiguous tended to be dismissed or excused. And perhaps most importantly, staff listening to the victim and expressing a sense of belief and validation. And we know that this is so important to victim survivors. So a response that expresses blame or doubt about what happened tends to shut down further disclosure. Okay, so on to justice responses. So again, this is a highly under-researched area. We know very little overall about criminal justice system responses to older women victim survivors specifically. That said, we know for victim survivors in general that sexual violence is highly underreported, as I said before. So we know that around 85% of cases are never reported to the criminal justice system. And the evidence that we do have around older women suggests that their experiences are also underreported. So some qualitative Australian research found that for the women in their study, most incidents weren't reported to the police. We do have one population level study from America about elder sexual abuse specifically, that found that only 16% of victims in this study reported their experiences to the police. So that's certainly in line with what we know about reporting of sexual violence more broadly. We also know that there's really high rates of attrition in the criminal justice system for sexual assault cases in general. So that means that if something is reported to the police, there's only a small number of those cases that will proceed to prosecution. And of those that proceed to prosecution, only a very small number will be successfully convicted. So we see this filtering out of cases as they progress through the criminal justice system. So we do know for older women that cases that have a cognitively impaired victim are much more likely to be dropped from the criminal justice system. And it seems that this is because they're unable to reliably or clearly communicate their experience. So they're positioned as an unreliable witness. And this is quite important in sexual assault cases where most of the time the only evidence is the perpetrator's word against the victim. So if we have a victim who's unable to clearly express what's happened to her, that can create significant challenges in successfully prosecuting and convicting. The only exception here was if there was another witness to the assault, so someone who had seen what happened and was able to clearly articulate to police what had gone on. We also know that police aren't actually trained to interview cognitively impaired victims or trained how to build a case or evidence in cases where there is a cognitively impaired victim. So I would actually suggest that rather than a cognitively impaired person being unable to reliably or clearly communicate their experience, the issue is more that we don't actually know how to understand or make sense of what they are telling us. So we know that there are a range of factors that are likely to be acting as barriers to achieving justice through the formal criminal justice system. So firstly, as I touched on before, there's issues around reporting and disclosure. So if an incident isn't disclosed or reported to the criminal justice system, it's very difficult to actually do anything about that incident within the system. And there is evidence to suggest that older women in particular might experience heightened stigma, shame and embarrassment around sexual violence, particularly women who might have grown up in an age where talking about anything to do with sex was highly taboo. Older women might not recognise or label experiences of sexual assault. So, for example, many older women at the moment would have grown up in a time where rape within marriage wasn't against the law. So whether or not these older women now understand that their husbands can legally be held accountable for sexual violence is questionable. And certainly some Australian qualitative research suggests that older women still don't recognise something like rape within marriage. Within the context of intimate partner violence, it might just be the case that sexual violence has been normalised and just accepted as part of that ongoing relationship abuse. Cognitive impairment I've touched on already. Many older women might actually rely on their perpetrator for care and support, so they might be fearful that if they report their perpetrator to the police, that they'll lose that source of care. Older women, particularly in aged care facilities, might rely on or are more likely to rely on aged care providers to actually identify and report incidents. Again, that's particularly the case for women with cognitive impairments or with verbal communication difficulties. And as we saw earlier, aged care service providers might not always be well equipped to actually identify and report what's gone on. And there's also some evidence that even when incidents of sexual assault are recognised, that there's a tendency for aged care facilities to want to deal with things in-house rather than reporting to the police. We also know that there's myths and misperceptions about sexual violence against older women in particular. So I mentioned before, older women are seen as not being at risk because they're asexual. Although I think it will be interesting to see if this actually shifts as we start to see the baby boomers in particular being much more likely to date and enter new relationships in later life and being more open about their sexual relationships, whether this shifts and we start to see some of the more common victim blaming attitudes of, well, you were asking for it and that kind of thing. We also see this misperception that sexual violence will only occur against an older person if it's happening in the context of another crime. So, it's that someone happens to be breaking into their house and sexually assaults them. And I think this is really tied into the idea that that's because older women are asexual. So we also see ageist attitudes coming into play here. So ageism refers to this systematic devaluation and loss of power that happens to older people as they get older. And this filters into how we view sexual violence against older women. So one issue that we see raised in the literature is this idea that sexual violence against older women isn't as serious or harmful, for example, because they didn't really understand what happened, especially if they're cognitively impaired, or things like, well, they're old and they're going to die soon anyway, so what does it matter? Of course, there are challenges in investigating. So as I touched on before, older women, and particularly with impaired health and cognitive impairments, can have reduced or perceived credibility. It is challenging to investigate if victims are reluctant or unable to speak openly about what's happened. As with all sexual assaults, there's very rarely other people who witness what happens, so it is the victim's word against the perpetrator. And as I said before, we rarely see additional physical injury or tangible evidence. So these all create substantial barriers. So what can we actually do within the context of the criminal justice system to improve criminal justice responses more specifically? So I think some initial steps that we can look at taking include, firstly, training police to actually interview those with dementia and other cognitive impairments so that they're able to actually build solid evidence and a solid case for victim survivors who have these impairments. I think it's important to look at the video recording of initial evidence or initial interviews with older victim survivors. This is particularly the case because, as we saw, older women might be particularly likely to have a rapid decline in health or to pass away. So having that initial evidence on file means that a case can still be proceeded with through the criminal justice system. Relatedly, we need to look at how we can actually develop techniques for prosecuting cases, particularly that involve a victim with cognitive impairment. And I think part of the way that we can do this is by strengthening relationships between police and criminal justice workers, with gerontologists and ageing experts, as well as sexual assault service providers. So in working towards justice within the criminal justice system, we do also need to look at the role of aged care service providers, particularly for older women who are sexually assaulted in aged care settings. So firstly, ensuring that service providers are actually trained in sexual assault, so they have a sound understanding of what sexual assault is, but also that they know how to respond appropriately when a disclosure is made, and training these staff in how to recognise signs that an assault might have occurred, so they're aware of those impacts that I went through earlier. They're aware of what to look out for, particularly for non-verbal and cognitively impaired women, that something might have gone on. Certainly developing stronger relationships with police and support service providers so that aged care service providers know where to go if something does happen. And certainly implementation of clear policy and practice protocols so that there are clear procedures in place to guide responses when an incident does occur. And we might also want to think more broadly about the culture and design of aged care facilities to avoid re-traumatisation and to reduce the likelihood that sexual violence can occur in the first place. So this is referred to as trauma-informed design. So this is important firstly because as I touched on at the start of the presentation, a substantial minority of people in aged care facilities will have experienced sexual violence at some point in their lives. as well as sexual violence taking place within aged care facilities. So aged care facilities are often designed in ways that minimise the amount of autonomy and control that residents have over their day-to-day lives and routines. So a trauma-informed design and operation really aims to maximise the amount of control and autonomy that residents have, so enabling them to take care of their own toileting and cleaning needs, you know, dressing themselves, etc., as much as they're able to. And finally, I think there is some need here to work with older victim survivors, particularly in terms of educating older women around what actually constitutes sexual assault, so that we can help overcome some of those barriers around older women perhaps not understanding that certain things constitute sexual assault, or having a limited understanding of what sexual assault is. Awareness raising about appropriate support services so that older women are aware of what's out there, and encouraging them to seek the support that they might need. And of course, working to create safe spaces and trusting relationships to actually facilitate disclosures in the first place, and enabling older women to speak out. But as I said, these are all very under-researched areas, so I would also certainly advocate for further research across each of these domains. Okay, now very quickly in the 10 minutes or so that we have left, I just want to look at two alternative ways of thinking about justice that really extend beyond the formal criminal justice system when we think about what achieving justice might look like for older women. So as I mentioned, we know that the criminal justice system has some very well acknowledged limitations in responding to sexual violence in general. So we know most victims don't report, and we know that so many cases are filtered out of the system. We also know that for those survivors who do go to court, that process is often highly re-traumatizing. So because of this, we see feminist scholars advocating for what we call victim-centered justice. So victim-centered justice is really focused on what we call victim survivors' justice needs. So that is, what do survivors themselves say they need to happen to feel as though a sense of justice has been achieved in response to what happened to them. And some of the most commonly identified needs include things like having a voice, so being able to share their experiences in their own words and in a way that's meaningful to them, being believed and validated when they disclose and share their experiences with others, having a sense of control, so for example, control over whether your case is reported to the criminal justice system, having a perpetrator apologise and acknowledge and recognise what they've done and the harm that it's caused to the victim. And of course, for some victims, things like punishment through the criminal justice system can be really important. But certainly this is a much broader understanding of justice than what we might see in the formal criminal justice system. And how these needs are met can really vary across individual victim survivors. So it can involve those formal criminal justice responses, but it might also involve more informal responses like having the perpetrator apologise. However, all of the research that's been done on this has looked more specifically at younger and mid-adult victim survivors. So we actually don't know much about how older women themselves conceptualise justice, what their particular justice needs are, and the type of justice responses that they think would help meet those justice needs. So this is really another area that we need to see further research in. The final justice response or framework that I want to look at quickly is social justice. So I'm drawing on Nancy Fraser's conceptualization of social justice here, which is really about generating social arrangements that permit all members of society to interact with one another as peers. So really, this type of approach is paying attention to the broader systems or structures of power in which the sexual assault of older women is taking place. And it looks at changing those power structures more broadly as they contribute to sexual violence occurring, rather than being concerned with responding to individual incidents of sexual violence. So based on Nancy Fraser's framework, she's arguing that in order to achieve social justice, we need to pay attention to two things. So firstly is how material resources and power are distributed. So this is the structural aspect. So things like distribution of financial wealth. And the second thing that we need to look at is the cultural value that we assign to different groups. And of course, these two things are quite interlinked and overlap with one another. So groups who are culturally devalued, for example, also tend to be structurally disadvantaged. So how might we apply this to sexual violence against older women, and what are some of the relationships here between these structural and representational issues and sexual violence? So firstly, I think this suggests a need to address the structural inequalities that older people can face in Western societies, although again, these inequalities do differ quite dramatically when we look at people from different racial groups, classes, and gender, of course. But we could look at issues like increasing the autonomy of older women, particularly in aged care settings, which I've already touched on. But this would also require things like ensuring that there's appropriate economic support and independence for older people. So, for example, the provision of welfare and an adequate aged care pension, appropriate access to carers, and this is particularly important, as we've seen, because older women won't report if they're reliant on their perpetrator to fulfill their care needs. So could this perhaps be reduced if we had a system in which carers were made more readily available to older people? We also see the persistent underfunding and understaffing of aged care facilities, and this can mean things like reduced supervision of aged care service providers, which might increase the ability of staff to isolate older victims. So we also need to address ageism. So as I mentioned earlier, this is that systematic loss of power and authority that can accompany aging. And this is also quite gendered and increases as we enter deeper old age. So we do see these stereotypes that devalue older people. So the idea that older people are a burden, that they're past it, that they're no longer useful or productive members of society, particularly as they're being locked out of the workforce or systems of production. And we've already seen how these values can influence responses to sexual violence. So, for example, that it doesn't happen as much to older people, or that it impacts on them less if it does happen, or it doesn't matter as much because they're going to die soon anyway. So it's also vitally important that we continue to address gender inequality across the life course, as well as gender inequality in later life. So, for example, we know that women are structurally disadvantaged across their life course. We see this in things like pay inequality, the fact that they're less likely to work full-time, and so forth. So this has follow-on implications for later in life. So we know that older women are now one of the largest cohorts of homeless people and one of the largest cohorts of people who are living in poverty in later life. And this in turn can make older women more vulnerable to sexual violence, for example, because they need to engage in subsistence sex in order to pay the rent, or get access to resources, but it will also make them less able to leave abusive relationships because they don't have the financial means to support themselves. So we need to look at how inequality manifests across the life course, and how inequality earlier in life has follow-on implications for women as they get older. This also ties into the cultural devaluation of women as a collective group, and again, the intersections of gender and age. So certainly ageism is gendered, and older women are devalued in quite specific ways. So the idea of the older woman as asexual is certainly one example. The idea that women are somehow less useful once they're past their reproductive years, or that they're, old biddies or silly old women, or etc. So we see these quite specific gendered devaluations of older women, and of course this is something that we see in different manifestations across the life course. And this, of course, ties into myths and misperceptions about sexual violence against older women. Okay, so very quickly to wrap up, because I know I'm out of time. So the key points here were, firstly, that sexual violence against older women is an emerging issue. There's one which, at the moment, the evidence suggests that the prevalence rates are quite low, but there are very substantial limitations with the research and the data that we have. There are very substantial limitations associated with current criminal justice responses and access to justice across a range of different domains. And finally, and I think the most important point of the presentation, is that we really need to be taking a multifaceted or multi-pronged approach to justice. So we need to look at how we can develop better and more effective justice responses and facilitate access to justice across a range of different domains. So thank you so much. I'm so sorry that I'm not here live because of the time difference, but please feel free to contact me with any questions that you might have, either on email or social media. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bianca, and thank you to everyone who attended today. As Bianca said, if you have any question, you can get in touch with her. Her email is visible on your screen right now. And if you have any doubt, you can always contact me, and I'll be happy to put you in touch. We will upload this presentation to our YouTube channel shortly, so if you had to leave early or if you missed the starts, you can find it there. And this was the very first webinar in a series which will stretch over the next 3 years as part of our project Increasing Access to Justice for Older Adult Victims of Sexual Assault. So if you wish to learn more about all of this, you can go to cnpea.ca or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And one last thing, this is part of our project evaluation, so we'll be sending you a link to a short survey very soon, so you can give us a bit of feedback on this webinar and what you thought of it. So I hope that you will take some time to participate. Our next webinar for the project will be taking place in mid-April, and we'll have more details very soon. So let's hope you'll be there. Thank you very much again, and have a good day. Bye.